Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the research station's emergency shelter, her breath coming in short gasps. Outside, the howling winds of Kepler 442c carried the sound she had hoped never to hear again, the hunting calls of adult Vorthak. The planet had seemed perfect for their xenobiology research team. Dense forests, abundant water sources, and what appeared to be a thriving ecosystem. The Galactic Council had classified it as safe after preliminary scans showed no sentient species. They had been wrong. Sarah clutched the small emergency beacon in her trembling hands. Her research team was scattered across the continent, and communications had been down for 3 days. The adult Vorthak had appeared without warning, massive creatures standing nearly 3 meters tall, with razor-sharp claws and intelligence that burned in their golden eyes. They had torn through the main research facility like it was made of paper. A soft scratching sound of the shelter's rear wall made her freeze. The emergency protocols were clear. Stay hidden, wait for rescue, avoid all contact with indigenous life forms. But the sound wasn't the heavy footfalls of an adult predator. It was something smaller, more tentative. Sarah moved carefully toward the back of the shelter, where a small ventilation grate led to the outside. Through the metal slats, she could see movement in the undergrowth. Her scientific training overcame her fear as she recognized what she was looking at. 3 Vorthak cubs, no larger than house cats, were huddled together in a small depression near the shelter. Their fur was a lighter shade than the adults she had seen, more gray than the deep black of their parents. One of them was limping badly, dark blood matting the fur on its left rear leg. The smallest of the 3 kept making soft, mewing sounds that tugged at something deep in Sarah's chest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden. These were the offspring of the creatures that had killed at least 4 members of her team. But as she watched, the injured cub collapsed, its breathing becoming labored. The other 2 pressed closer to their sibling, their own small bodies shivering in the cold night air. Sarah found herself thinking about her own childhood, about the stray animals she had always brought home despite her parents' protests. Her mother used to say that Sarah's heart was too big for her own good. Maybe that was why she had become a xenobiologist in the first place, to understand and help creatures that others feared. The injured cub's breathing was getting weaker. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She carefully opened the small maintenance hatch at the back of the shelter, just wide enough to squeeze through. The cubs noticed her immediately, their large eyes reflecting the dim light from her emergency lamp. They didn't run. Instead, they watched her with a mixture of curiosity and desperation that seemed almost human. Sarah moved slowly, speaking in soft, soothing tones the way she had with frightened animals back on Earth. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." The 2 healthy cubs positioned themselves protectively in front of their injured sibling, small growls rumbling in their throats. But they didn't attack. Sarah could see intelligence in their eyes, awareness that went far beyond simple animal instinct. She reached into her emergency pack and pulled out a basic medical kit. The injured cub was losing blood, and she could see bone through the wound on its leg. Without proper treatment, it would die within hours. "Easy," she murmured, extending her hand toward the protective cubs. "I want to help." The largest of the 2 guardians, its fur marked with distinctive white patches around its ears, took a step forward. It sniffed her outstretched hand, its nostrils flaring as it processed her scent. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and human stared at each other. Then the cub did something that defied everything the research team thought they knew about Vorthak behavior. It stepped aside and made a low, rumbling sound that seemed almost like purring. Sarah approached the injured cub carefully, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The wound was deep but clean, probably from falling on sharp rocks while fleeing whatever had separated them from their parents. She cleaned it gently with antiseptic, surprised when the cub held still despite what must have been considerable pain. As she worked, the other 2 cubs moved closer, watching her every movement with intense focus. The white-eared one even extended its own small paw to gently hold down its sibling, while Sarah applied bandages from her kit. "You understand, don't you?" Sarah whispered as she finished treating the wound. "You know I'm trying to help." The cub's response was to curl up around her, their warm bodies pressing against her legs as the injured one rested its head on her lap. For the first time since the attack on the research station, Sarah felt something other than fear. She stayed with them through the night, keeping watch while they slept. Her emergency rations were running low, but she shared what she had, watching in fascination as the cubs delicately ate the protein bar she offered. They were clearly intelligent enough to recognize food that was safe to eat, even if it wasn't part of their natural diet. When morning came, Sarah faced a choice. She could return to the shelter, lock herself in, and wait for rescue while the cubs wandered off to face whatever dangers lurked in the forest. Or she could do something that went against every regulation in the Galactic Council's first contact protocols. The injured cub looked up at her, with golden eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond its years. The white-eared one pressed against her side, its small claws gently kneading her jacket. The third cub, the smallest, had spent most of the night curled up against her neck, its soft purring a constant comfort in the darkness. Sarah made her choice. She gathered her emergency supplies and prepared to follow the cubs deeper into the forest. If rescue came, they would find an empty shelter. If it didn't, at least she wouldn't be alone. The cubs seemed to understand her decision. The white-eared one took the lead, frequently looking back to make sure she was following. The smallest stayed close to her side, while the injured one walked carefully, already putting weight on its bandaged leg. As they moved through the dense undergrowth, Sarah began to notice things about Vorthack behavior that their preliminary observations had missed. The cubs communicated with a complex series of chirps, rumbles, and body language that suggested a sophisticated social structure. They knew exactly where they were going, following scent trails that were invisible to human senses. More importantly, they had accepted her as part of their group. When she stumbled over a fallen log, the white-eared cub immediately came back to check on her. When she stopped to rest, they arranged themselves around her in a protective formation that spoke of instinctive pack behavior. Hours passed as they traveled deeper into the forest. Sarah's legs ached, and her water supply was running dangerously low, but the cubs showed no signs of fatigue. They moved with the efficient grace of natural predators, even the injured one managing to keep pace. It was the smallest cub that first detected the danger. Its ears perked up suddenly, and it made a series of urgent clicking sounds that immediately got the attention of its siblings. The white-eared one moved to Sarah's side while the injured cub, despite its bandaged leg, positioned itself between her and whatever threat it sensed. The adult Vorthack emerged from the undergrowth like shadows made flesh. 3 of them, each nearly 3 meters tall, their black fur rippling over powerful muscles. Their golden eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her knees weak. But something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking, the adults stopped when they saw the cubs. The largest of the 3, a massive male with scars across his muzzle, approached slowly. His attention focused not on Sarah, but on the injured cub she had treated. The white-eared cub stepped forward and began making a series of complex vocalizations, its body language animated and urgent. Sarah watched in amazement as what could only be described as a conversation took place between the cubs and the adult male. The scarred male's eyes kept returning to the bandage on the injured cub's leg. He moved closer, sniffing carefully at Sarah's medical work. His massive head turned to look at her, and for a moment she saw something that shocked her to the core. Gratitude. The adult Vorthack understood what she had done. More than that, they approved of it. The moment of recognition passed, but its implications hung in the air like electricity. Sarah had just experienced first contact with a species that the Galactic Council had dismissed as non-sentient. The cubs she had helped weren't just animals, they were children, and their parents had just acknowledged her as someone who had protected their young. The scarred male made a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the forest floor. The other two adults moved to flank Sarah, but not in a threatening way. Instead, they formed a protective escort as the male turned and began walking deeper into the forest. The message was clear. Sarah was being invited to follow. As they walked, the injured cub pressed close to her side, occasionally looking up at her with those impossibly intelligent golden eyes. The white-eared one ranged ahead with the adult male, clearly reporting everything that had happened during their separation. The smallest cub had claimed a position riding on Sarah's shoulder, its tiny claws gripping her jacket as it surveyed their surroundings with alert curiosity. Sarah realized that her life had just taken a turn that no amount of xenobiology training could have prepared her for. She was walking through an alien forest, surrounded by apex predators who had accepted her into their family group based on her kindness to their children. The Galactic Council's first contact protocols had never anticipated a scenario like this. There would be questions, investigations, and probably court-martial proceedings if she ever made it back to human space. But as she looked down at the injured cub walking trustingly beside her, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, she was no longer just a stranded researcher waiting for rescue. She was part of something unprecedented, a bridge between species that had the potential to change how the galaxy understood intelligence, family, and the bonds that could form between the most unlikely companions. The forest around them was full of sounds and scents that spoke of hidden life and ancient wisdom. Somewhere ahead lay answers to questions that Sarah was only beginning to understand. But for now, it was enough to walk among predators who had chosen to trust her with their most precious possessions, their children. The cubs chattered softly among themselves as they traveled, occasionally including her in their conversations with questioning chirps and expectant looks. Sarah found herself responding instinctively, using tone and gesture to communicate in ways that transcended language barriers. She was learning that intelligence took many forms, and that the universe was far more complex and wonderful than the Galactic Council had ever imagined. The cubs had taught her something that would reshape humanity's understanding of life among the stars. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries came not from sophisticated instruments or careful research protocols, but from simple acts of compassion shared between species that had every reason to fear each other. The Vorthax settlement appeared through the trees like something from a dream. Sarah had expected caves or crude dens, but what she saw challenged every assumption about primitive alien species. Elegant structures rose from the forest floor, woven from living branches, and reinforced with what appeared to be a natural resin that gleamed like amber in the filtered sunlight. The scarred male, whom Sarah had mentally dubbed Scar, paused at the settlement's edge and made a series of deep, resonant calls. Dozens of adult Vorthax emerged from the structures, their golden eyes focusing on the human in their midst. Children of various ages peered from behind their parents, their smaller forms mirror images of the cubs that had led Sarah here. The white-eared cub, whom she had started calling Patch, bounded forward to greet what were obviously family members. Sarah watched the reunion with growing amazement as complex vocalizations passed between the adults and cubs, accompanied by intricate body language that spoke of sophisticated communication. A female Vorthax approached, her movements graceful and deliberate. She was smaller than Scar, but carried herself with unmistakable authority. Her fur was darker than the others, almost midnight black, with silver threads that caught the light as she moved. When she reached Sarah, she stopped and extended one massive clawed hand. Sarah looked at the offered paw, then at the intelligent golden eyes watching her. She slowly reached out and placed her much smaller hand against the Vorthax palm. The contact sent a shock of recognition through both species. The universal gesture of greeting developed independently on worlds separated by hundreds of light years. The female made a sound that somehow conveyed approval. She turned to examine the injured cub, carefully inspecting Sarah's bandage work. Her large head tilted as she studied the human medical supplies. Then, She looked back at Sarah with what could only be described as professional interest. Scar moved to stand beside the female, and Sarah realized she was looking at the cub's parents. The family resemblance was clear now that she saw them together. Patch had inherited the distinctive ear markings from his father, while the smallest cub shared her mother's midnight black coloring. What happened next redefined Sarah's understanding of alien intelligence. The female Vorthack disappeared into one of the nearby structures and returned carrying something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a medical kit, clearly not of human manufacture, but recognizably sophisticated in its design and purpose. The female opened the kit with practiced ease, revealing instruments that served obvious medical functions despite their alien design. She gestured toward the injured cub, then to Sarah's emergency supplies, making it clear that she wanted to observe and learn from the humans' treatment methods. "You're a doctor," Sarah whispered in amazement. "You're their doctor." The female's ears perked up at the word doctor, and she repeated the sound with remarkable accuracy. Sarah pointed to herself and said doctor again, then gestured to the female and repeated the word. The Vorthack female touched her own chest and made a complex series of sounds that Sarah tried unsuccessfully to reproduce. They spent the next hour in an impromptu medical conference, sharing techniques for treating wounds and injuries. The female doctor showed Sarah how Vorthack medicine used various plant extracts and natural compounds that promoted healing. In return, Sarah demonstrated the antiseptic properties of her human medical supplies. The injured cub bore this attention with remarkable patience, occasionally adding his own commentary in soft chirps that made both doctors pause their work to listen. Sarah began to suspect that the young Vorthack was actually describing the pain levels and sensations he was experiencing, providing valuable diagnostic information. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself integrated into the settlement's daily activities. The cubs served as enthusiastic translators, bridging the communication gap between human and Vorthack with a combination of gestures, sounds, and what could only be described as interpretive play acting. She watched in fascination as adult Vorthack engaged in activities that spoke of advanced civilization. Some worked with tools that shaped the living architecture of their homes, encouraging plants to grow in specific patterns and directions. Others tended to what were clearly agricultural plots, where non-native plants grew alongside indigenous species. The most surprising discovery came when Patch led her to a large clearing where dozens of young Vorthack were engaged in what could only be described as education. Adult teachers used a combination of demonstration and vocalization to pass on knowledge about hunting, medicine, plant cultivation, and even what appeared to be mathematics based on natural patterns. Sarah realized she was witnessing a sophisticated society that had achieved harmony with their environment in ways that most galactic civilizations could only dream of. The Vorthack had developed technology, but it worked with nature rather than against it. Their buildings lived and grew. Their medicine came from deep understanding of biological systems, and their education focused on passing down accumulated wisdom through generations. The smallest cub, whom Sarah had named Whisper for her soft vocalizations, appointed herself as Sarah's personal guide. She led the human through the settlement, introducing her to various family groups and demonstrating proudly how the strange new friend could walk on two legs and use her clever hands to perform tasks that required tools. Other cubs flocked around Sarah, their curiosity overcoming any natural caution their parents might have wished them to show. They tested her responses to their vocalizations, delighted when she attempted to mimic their sounds. They examined her clothing and equipment with gentle claws, always careful not to damage anything, but clearly fascinated by the foreign materials and construction. The adult Vorthack watched these interactions with obvious amusement and growing approval. Sarah began to understand that she was being evaluated not just as an individual, but as a representative of her entire species. The cub's acceptance of her had opened a door, but it It was her own actions that would determine whether that door remained open. As evening approached, the female doctor approached Sarah again. This time, she carried a collection of plant specimens, each carefully preserved and labeled with markings that resembled a writing system. She laid them out systematically and began what was clearly a formal lesson in Vorthack pharmacology. Sarah pulled out her tablet and began recording everything, using its translation software to analyze the sounds associated with each plant. The Vorthack doctor watched the device with keen interest, quickly understanding its purpose. She began speaking more slowly and clearly, obviously adapting her teaching style to help the translation program function more effectively. The breakthrough came when Sarah successfully identified a plant that served the same purpose as one of her human antibiotics. The excitement in the doctor's golden eyes was unmistakable as she realized that despite their different evolutionary paths, both species had discovered similar solutions to common medical problems. Scar joined them as full darkness fell, bringing with him several other adult males who had clearly heard about the remarkable events of the day. Sarah found herself the center of attention as the Vorthack leadership gathered to observe this unprecedented contact with an alien species. But instead of the formal diplomatic meeting she might have expected, the interaction took on the atmosphere of a family gathering. Cubs climbed over their parents and pestered the adults with excited accounts of their day with the human. The injured cub proudly displayed his bandaged leg, clearly recounting the story of his rescue and treatment. Sarah noticed that the adult Vorthack paid careful attention to everything the cubs reported. This was more than family gossip. It was a comprehensive debriefing about her character, capabilities, and potential threat level. The cubs were serving as character witnesses, and their testimony was being taken very seriously indeed. The smallest cub, Whisper, had claimed a position curled up against Sarah's side. Her tiny claws kneaded Sarah's jacket as she purred contentedly, occasionally looking up at the adults as if to say, "See, she's one of us now." As the gathering continued into the night, Sarah began to pick up patterns in the Vorthack language. Their communication was incredibly complex, with layers of meaning conveyed through tone, body position, and contextual references that drew on shared cultural knowledge. But it was definitely a language complete with grammar, syntax, and abstract concepts that went far beyond simple animal communication. The turning point came when one of the male elders approached carrying what was obviously a precious artifact. It was a crystal formation that had been carefully shaped and polished, covered in intricate markings that were clearly some form of advanced writing. He placed it in front of Sarah and began what could only be described as a formal recitation. Even without understanding the words, Sarah recognized the cadence and structure of historical narrative. The elder was telling her the story of his people, sharing their origins and achievements with the first alien visitor to be accepted into their society. Patch positioned himself next to Sarah and began providing what appeared to be translation, using gestures and simple vocalizations to help her understand key concepts. Other cubs joined in, creating an impromptu interpretation service that bridged the gap between species. Sarah learned that the Vorthack had a rich oral tradition stretching back thousands of years. They had survived planetary disasters, built their civilization from the ground up, and developed their own unique approach to technology and social organization. They were not primitive predators struggling for survival. They were an ancient and sophisticated culture with their own philosophy, science, and art. The most remarkable revelation came when the elder showed her markings on the crystal that clearly represented astronomical observations. The Vorthack had mapped the stars, understood planetary motion, and even detected the approach of spacecraft from other worlds. They had known about the galactic community for generations, but had chosen to remain hidden, observing and learning while keeping their existence secret. "You've been watching us," Sarah breathed, suddenly understanding. "You knew we were here all along." Scar's rumbling response needed no translation. His golden eyes held a mixture of amusement and approval that confirmed her suspicions. The Vorthack had been conducting their own study of the human research team, learning about their technology, behavior, and intentions. The attack on the research station hadn't been random violence. It had been a defensive response to what the Vorthack perceived as a threat to their young. Human equipment and procedures had somehow endangered the cubs, triggering a protective response from the adults. But Sarah's treatment of the injured cubs had changed everything. Her willingness to risk her own safety to help their children had demonstrated that humans were capable of compassion and self-sacrifice. It was the kind of moral courage that the Vorthack valued above all other traits. As the night deepened, Sarah found herself accepted into the heart of an alien family. The cubs curled up around her as they had the previous night, but now their parents watched with approval rather than wariness. She was no longer a stranger taking shelter with lost children. She was a valued member of the pack, someone who had proven herself worthy of trust. The female doctor approached one final time before the gathering dispersed. She carried a small pouch made from woven plant fibers, filled with aromatic herbs that seemed to have medicinal properties. She pressed it into Sarah's hands with a series of vocalizations that Patch quickly translated through gestures. It was a gift, but more than that, it was a symbol of professional recognition. The Vorthack doctor was acknowledging Sarah as a colleague, someone whose skills and knowledge deserved respect despite the differences in their species and training. As Sarah settled down for the night, surrounded by sleeping cubs, she realized that everything had changed. She was no longer a stranded researcher waiting for rescue. She had become something unprecedented, humanity's first ambassador to a hidden civilization that had been watching the stars long before humans learned to build spacecraft. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and discoveries. But tonight, surrounded by the soft sounds of sleeping predators who had accepted her as family, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since the attack on the research station. She felt like she was home. The rescue ships appeared in Kepler 442c sky 3 weeks after Sarah had first encountered the cubs. She spotted the atmospheric entry trails from her position in the Vorthack settlement's central teaching grove, where she had been helping the cubs practice their growing collection of human words. Patch noticed the ships first, his enhanced senses detecting the electromagnetic signatures long before human eyes could see them. His excited chittering brought the attention of every Vorthack in the settlement, and within minutes the entire community was discussing the arrival of more humans. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety. The Galactic Council rescue team would be following standard first contact protocols, which meant armed shuttles, protective gear, and a complete lack of understanding about what they were walking into. If they saw the Vorthack as dangerous predators, the peaceful contact she had established could turn into a disaster. Scar approached her with his mate, both parents wearing expressions of concern that needed no translation. The cubs pressed close to Sarah's legs, sensing the tension in the adults around them. Whisper made soft, questioning sounds that cut straight to Sarah's heart. "They're my people," Sarah said, knowing that the adult Vorthack had learned enough human words to follow her basic meaning. "But they don't understand. They think you're dangerous." The female doctor, whom Sarah had learned was called something that roughly translated to bright claw, tilted her massive head thoughtfully. She had become remarkably good at reading human facial expressions over the past weeks, and Sarah's worry was clearly visible. Bright Claw moved to a communication device that Sarah hadn't noticed before, a living structure that seemed to be part plant, part technology. She manipulated it with practiced ease, generating sounds that traveled far beyond the settlement. Within minutes, responses came back from distant locations, a network of communication that spanned the continent. Sarah realized that every Vorthack settlement was being warned about the approaching humans. But instead of preparation for war, what she witnessed was preparation for contact. Adult Vorthack began gathering artifacts, historical records, and examples of their technology. They were preparing for a diplomatic meeting, not a battle. "You want to meet them?" Sarah said in amazement. "You've been waiting for this." Scar's rumbling response was accompanied by gestures that had become familiar over the weeks. He was confirming her suspicions while expressing concern about how the humans would react. The Vorthak had been studying galactic civilization for generations, but they had never attempted direct contact before. The cubs seemed to understand the importance of what was happening. Patch positioned himself protectively near Sarah, while the injured cub, now fully healed and bearing only a small scar as evidence of their first meeting, stood ready to translate. Whisper climbed onto Sarah's shoulder, her small form trembling with excitement rather than fear. Sarah's communicator crackled to life for the first time in weeks. Dr. Chun, this is Commander Harrison aboard the GCS Resolution. Please respond if you can hear this transmission. Sarah looked around at the Vorthak family that had adopted her, at the cubs who had bridged the gap between species through trust and innocent affection. She thought about the medical knowledge she had gained, the cultural insights that could reshape galactic understanding of intelligence and civilization. Commander Harrison, this is Dr. Chun. I'm alive and, well, but I need to warn you about something important. The indigenous species on this planet are not what we thought. Static filled the channel for several seconds before Harrison's voice returned, tight with concern. Dr. Chun, are you under duress? We're reading multiple large life forms in your vicinity. I'm perfectly safe, Commander. In fact, I'm probably safer than I've ever been in my life. But you need to understand, the Vorthak are not primitive predators. They're a sophisticated civilization that has been observing galactic society for centuries. The silence that followed was so long that Sarah thought the communication link had failed. When Harrison finally responded, his voice carried the weight of someone whose worldview was rapidly shifting. Dr. Chun, are you telling me we're dealing with a first contact scenario? I'm telling you that first contact already happened 3 weeks ago, Sarah replied. And it happened because 3 cubs taught me that intelligence and compassion can exist in forms we never expected. Over the next hour, Sarah served as interpreter between the rescue team and the Vorthak leadership. The conversations were awkward at first, hampered by language barriers and mutual suspicion. But the cubs served as living proof that peaceful coexistence was possible. When the first shuttle landed in the settlement's central clearing, the Vorthak were ready. Scar and Bright Claw stood with their children, flanked by the community's elders and teachers. They had prepared gifts, examples of their living architecture, medical compounds that could revolutionize galactic healthcare, and historical records that proved their ancient observation of the stars. Commander Harrison emerged from the shuttle with a full diplomatic team, their weapons powered down but ready. Sarah could see the fear and confusion in their eyes as they took in the sight of dozens of massive predators arranged in what was clearly a formal reception. Patch broke the tension by bounding forward to greet the newcomers, his tail wagging in the universal gesture of friendliness. He looked back at Sarah with golden eyes that sparkled with mischief, then attempted his carefully practiced English greeting. "Hello, humans," he said in accented but clearly understandable words. "Welcome, family." The reaction from the diplomatic team was everything Sarah had hoped for. Harrison's mouth fell open, his aide dropped her data pad, and the xenobiologist in the group actually staggered backward in amazement. They were witnessing something that challenged every assumption about intelligence, communication, and the nature of civilization itself. What followed was the most remarkable diplomatic gathering in galactic history. The Vorthak elders, speaking through the cubs who had become natural interpreters, shared the history of their people and their observations of galactic society. They presented evidence of their scientific achievements, their sustainable technology, and their rich cultural traditions. The human diplomatic team found themselves completely unprepared for the depth and sophistication of Vorthak civilization. These were not primitive aliens who needed uplifting or protection from more advanced species. They were equals who had chosen isolation until the right moment for contact arrived. That moment had come through the innocent trust of children and the compassionate response of a human who put kindness above protocol. As the formal negotiations began, Sarah found herself in an unprecedented position. She was simultaneously translator, cultural advisor, and living proof that cooperation between the species was possible. The cubs who had started it all stayed close to her side, occasionally adding their own commentary to the proceedings. The breakthrough came when Bright Claw presented her medical research to the human xenobiologist. The compound she had developed could treat diseases that had plagued galactic civilization for centuries, while human medical technology offered solutions to problems that had challenged Vorthack healers for generations. "This is what cooperation looks like," Sarah said to Commander Harrison as they watched Bright Claw and the human doctor exchange notes through a mixture of words, gestures, and eager demonstration. "This is what we can accomplish when we see intelligence in unexpected forms." Harrison nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The Galactic Council is going to have to completely revise our first contact protocols and our assumptions about what constitutes advanced civilization." The formal agreements took days to negotiate, but the real diplomacy happened in smaller moments. Human children from the rescue team's families met Vorthack cubs and discovered that play was a universal language. Engineers marveled at living architecture that grew according to mathematical principles unknown to galactic science. Philosophers found themselves in deep discussions about consciousness, society, and the nature of intelligence. Sarah watched it all with a deep sense of satisfaction, but also with awareness of how easily it could have gone wrong. If the cubs hadn't found her shelter, if she had followed protocol and stayed hidden, if fear had overcome compassion at that crucial first moment, none of this would have happened. The Vorthack might have remained hidden for another century, observing galactic civilization from the shadows. Humanity would have continued to assume they were the only intelligent species on Kepler 442c. The incredible medical knowledge, the sustainable technology, the philosophical insights that were now being shared between species would have remained locked away. Instead, 3 lost cubs and one human's refusal to abandon them in their time of need had opened a door between civilizations. On her last night in the settlement, before returning to submit her reports to the Galactic Council, Sarah sat with the cubs who had changed everything. Patch had grown visibly in the weeks since their first meeting, his confidence boosted by his role as interpreter and diplomat. The formerly injured cub now bore his scar as a badge of honor, proof of the first healing performed by cross-species medical cooperation. Whisper had appointed herself as Sarah's personal secretary, keeping track of all the new words and concepts that were being exchanged. "You 3 changed the galaxy," Sarah told them as they curled up around her one final time. "You took a chance on a scared stranger, and because of that, our species will be friends forever." Patch's response needed no translation. His purring conveyed contentment, affection, and the deep satisfaction of a job well done. The injured cub nuzzled against her hand, while Whisper settled into her favorite position on Sarah's shoulder. Scar and Bright Claw approached, carrying a gift that took Sarah's breath away. It was a crystal similar to the historical artifact the Elder had shown her, but this one was new, created specifically for her. Etched into its surface was the story of first contact, told from the Vorthack perspective. It showed 3 cubs finding a lost human, the healing that brought them together, and the bridge of understanding that grew from that simple act of kindness. At the center of the crystal was an image that would become the symbol of human Vorthack cooperation, a small human hand touching a massive Vorthack paw. "For the Council," Bright Claw said in her carefully learned English. "So they understand. Cubs teach truth about friendship." Sarah accepted the gift with tears in her eyes. She would present it to the Galactic Council along with her reports, her medical findings, and her recommendations for ongoing cooperation. But more than any official document, this crystal would tell the real story of how first contact happened. It hadn't been achieved through advanced technology, careful planning, or diplomatic protocols. It had happened because 3 lost children trusted a stranger to help them, and that stranger chose compassion over fear. Years later, When the Galactic Council established the Chun protocols for interspecies contact, they would emphasize the importance of recognizing intelligence in unexpected forms and the power of simple kindness to bridge even the greatest differences between civilizations. But Sarah would always remember the true lesson that Patch, the injured cub, and Whisper had taught her on that first night in the forest. Sometimes the most important discoveries weren't made in laboratories or council chambers. They were made in moments of quiet courage when someone chose to help rather than hide, to trust rather than fear, to see a fellow thinking being rather than an alien threat. The cubs had shown her that the universe was full of friends she hadn't met yet. And because of their wisdom, humanity would never look at the stars the same way again. In the years that followed, as trade agreements flourished and joint research projects revolutionized everything from medicine to environmental science, the most popular ambassadors between the two species remained the youngest members of both civilizations. Human and Vorthack children learned each other's languages naturally, played together without the barriers that sometimes complicated adult interactions, and serve as living reminders of how simple acceptance could overcome any difference. The galaxy was a larger, more wonderful place because 3 lost cubs had decided to trust a stranger with their lives. And because one human had decided that helping children was more important than following rules. It was exactly the kind of lesson that cubs were born to teach, and exactly the kind that adults needed to learn.